Looking back, it's strange how the quietest moments often carry the loudest warnings. I can still see Lauren in my mind, humming softly as she washed dishes, or the way her steps had a little extra bounce whenever she was excited about something. Those small details used to bring me comfort. But over time, they faded, slowly at first, then all at once. The shift wasn't sudden, it crept in gradually, like a slow leak in a tire, one you don't notice until you're completely stranded. I've always been the kind of man who fixes things. Engines that won't turn over, pipes that won't stop leaking, relationships that feel like they're breaking apart. I've always rolled up my sleeves and done my best to patch them up. But with Lauren, no matter what I did, I couldn't seem to bring us back to where we used to be. The woman I had built a life with, the fiery redhead who could make me laugh just as easily as she could make me want to put my fist through a wall, was slipping away. And I was starting to wonder if I had any tools left to stop it. Over the past few months, she had grown distant, her moods unpredictable, our connection strained almost to the breaking point. The last 3 months had been rough, but this past one had been unbearable. Lauren had always worn her Irish temper like armor, using it as both a weapon and a shield. Our fights were legendary, passionate, volatile, exhausting. And the silences afterward? Even worse. We'd been together since high school, dating at 18 and married for 22 of our 26 years as a couple. She had always been sharp-edged, difficult, but I loved her anyway. I loved her fiery hair, her freckled skin, and the way she carried herself like she was constantly daring the world to push back. But lately, things had changed. This morning caught me off guard. After weeks of distance, she reached for me, running her fingers across my skin in a way that was almost tender. It was a sharp contrast to the woman I had been dealing with for weeks. Just the night before, she had stormed in late, demanding intimacy with a bluntness that turned into yet another fight. Afterward, she locked herself in the bathroom for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the shower masking whatever thoughts ran through her head. These episodes weren't new, but the way they dragged on lately was draining me. I used to know how to handle her moods, how to navigate her sharp turns. But this time, something felt off. We hadn't always been like this. In the beginning, we couldn't keep our hands off each other. Back when I was working as a mechanic and she had a job at Target, we lived on love and stolen moments. Life was simpler then, less money, fewer responsibilities, but somehow, we were happy. Things started shifting 8 years ago when I left my job as a mechanic to manage a Napa franchise. It was supposed to be a step up, a way to provide for our family and be more present for our kids, who were deep into sports. But Lauren hadn't seen it that way. She was livid when I took the job without running it by her first. Even when I tried to explain that it was the best move for us, that it would pay off in the long run, she didn't want to hear it. And in some ways, I get it. The job was supposed to give me more flexibility, but instead, it stole my nights and weekends. Lauren resented the stagnant salary, and my reassurances did little to ease her frustrations. The more time passed, the more it ate away at her. She became short-tempered, biting with her words, and more unpredictable than ever. 2 years ago, I noticed the real shift. She wasn't just irritated, she was different. Colder. Harder. Whenever I tried to talk to her about it, things would temporarily improve, but the tension always crawled back in, heavier than before. Meanwhile, my business was booming. We expanded to 4 locations, and I had built something I was genuinely proud of. But success came with sacrifices, and one of them was my marriage. Home wasn't home anymore. It was a battlefield. Lauren, now managing an insurance office, was buried under stress, and when I asked her what was wrong, I either got silence or another fight. This morning's unexpected tenderness left me uneasy. As I stood under the shower spray, I replayed her words in my head. "I like how you do it." She'd said it before, but today it felt different. Forced, maybe even rehearsed. Something about it gnawed at me, even as I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Our life had become a tangled mess of obligations, resentment, and unspoken words. Even the smallest gestures felt heavy with unspoken tension. As I got dressed and prepared for the day, I found myself thinking about the woman I had fallen in love with and the stranger I was now living with. We had both made choices over the years, choices that had built us up and worn us down in equal measure. That morning's fleeting moment of connection should have reassured me. Instead, it only highlighted the cracks that had been widening between us for years. By the weekend, the uneasy rhythm of our new normal had set back in. Lauren's irritability hadn't faded, and by Friday night, the cycle repeated itself. She came home late again, demanding intimacy as though it were some duty I owed her. But this time, she was even more forceful. Her tone dripped with entitlement, and something in me snapped. When she coldly muttered, "I need you to serve me," the words hit a nerve. I shot back, "I'm not at your beck and call. Handle it yourself." Refusing to give in, I grabbed a blanket and crashed in our son Ethan's old bedroom, the one that had been empty since he moved out months ago. The next morning, as I went back to our bedroom to grab a change of clothes, Lauren was in the shower. I wouldn't have thought much of it until I heard the ping of a text notification from her phone. I hadn't planned to look, but sometimes fate has other ideas. A few years ago, a phone update had made it so you could preview messages without unlocking the device. And this time, curiosity got the better of me. The message was from someone listed as KB. Well, did he do it? Confusion washed over me. Do what? My stomach twisted as I tried to make sense of it. Who was KB? And what did he do? My mind raced, piecing together the past 2 Fridays, Lauren's strange behavior, and the way she had whispered, "I like how you do it," like she was comparing me to someone else. A sick realization took root. Was I erasing someone else's presence? The thought turned my stomach. I barely made it to the bathroom before I vomited. From behind the shower curtain, Lauren called out, "Are you okay, honey?" I glanced at her, her wet hair clinging to her face, water trailing down her body. But instead of desire, I felt only revulsion. "I think I'm coming down with something," I muttered, needing an excuse to avoid her. She reached out to check my forehead, but I instinctively stepped back. "Stay away. I don't want you catching it." I retreated to Ethan's old room, feigning illness, but my mind wouldn't stop spinning. Had she been unfaithful? The woman I had built a life with, the one I had loved since we were teenagers. Was she even mine anymore? I needed answers. No, I needed proof. That afternoon, luck was on my side. Lauren's phone buzzed while she was in the kitchen. Another message from KB. I made a reservation for Wednesday afternoon. My stomach dropped. What kind of reservation? Afternoon meetings weren't common. My gut told me exactly what this was. I was going to follow her. For the next few days, I avoided Lauren as much as possible. Pretending to be sick gave me an excuse to keep my distance, but sleeping next to her Monday and Tuesday night was unbearable. Every time she touched me, my skin crawled. How quickly love could rot into resentment. When Wednesday came, I left work during lunch and drove to her office, parking on a side street where I had a clear view of the lot. My hands clenched the wheel as I waited. Hours passed. No sign of her leaving. My thoughts spiraled. Was I being paranoid? Had I misread the situation? At 2:30, her boss walked out alone and drove off, making me doubt myself further. And then, just as I was about to give up, Lauren stepped outside. A jolt of dread ran through me as I watched her walk to her car. I followed at a safe distance. She didn't go home. She didn't go to a meeting. She drove straight to a motel. Not a hotel with conference rooms. A roadside motel, the kind where the rooms faced the parking lot, where discretion is key. I parked where she wouldn't see me, my grip tightening on the steering wheel as she pulled up beside another car, her boss's. She didn't get out right away. Instead, she lingered in the driver's seat, adjusting something. And then I saw it. When she finally stepped out, she wasn't wearing a bra anymore. She walked to one of the rooms. Before she could knock, the door opened. Her boss stood there, in nothing but his underwear, welcoming her inside. I barely remembered pulling out my phone, my fingers shaking as I snapped picture after picture. My mind screamed at me to look away, to unsee what I had just witnessed, but I couldn't. The truth was right there in front of me. Betrayal, disrespect, humiliation. By the time I drove home, my rage had settled into something cold and quiet. Our house, sitting on the outskirts of town, had always been my retreat, but the garage, my workshop, was my real sanctuary. A 2-car space filled with tools, a car lift, and a small upstairs loft I called the doghouse. It was where I went when Lauren and I fought. Tonight, it was where I would live. I packed my things, moving into the garage. I wasn't sharing a bed with her anymore. When Lauren came home later that evening, she acted like nothing had happened. She was all charm, her voice dripping with false sweetness, trying to pull me back into her grasp. She had no idea what I knew. I let her play her game, watching her undress, listening to her purr words I had once craved. She stretched out on the bed, smirking. "Serve me, baby." Her eyes were closed, but mine weren't. I got up, pulled open a drawer, and grabbed a protection. She frowned. "What are you doing?" I met her gaze, my voice steady. "Taking precautions. I don't know where you've been, Her face twisted with rage. "You're nothing," she spat. "A pathetic auto parts manager who hasn't even asked for a raise in years." I stayed silent, calmly pulling on my clothes as she unleashed every insult she could muster. Every sacrifice I had made for our family, every effort I had poured into our marriage, it all meant nothing to her. I left without another word, retreating to the doghouse. Minutes later, she followed, her screams cutting through the night. She pounded on the garage door, demanding I come out. I ignored her, locked the door, moved furniture in front of it. Then I smelled it. Gasoline. Panic surged through me. I peered out the window and saw flames creeping along the base of the garage. Lauren had set it on fire. I scrambled for the second-story window, throwing it open. The heat was already rising, smoke curling toward me. I climbed onto the roof and jumped. Pain shot through my ankle as I hit the gravel, but I barely had time to process it. Lauren was already on me. She came at me, fists flying, her rage unhinged. I shielded myself as best I could, but before she could do any real damage. Police sirens cut through the chaos. 2 officers rushed in. One called for the fire department while the other grabbed Lauren, dragging her back as she shrieked, "Burn in hell, you bastard! Your precious doghouse is gone." The flames roared behind her. Lauren was arrested. Domestic violence. Arson. Maybe even attempted murder. By the time the fire was out, I had a restraining order in place. She was barred from coming within 150 yards of me, the house, or my workplace. Lauren remained in jail, awaiting arraignment, while I started the slow process of rebuilding my life. That evening, I sat down with our children and told them everything. Caitlin, our youngest, wasn't surprised. She'd seen her mother's temper for years and simply hugged me, offering quiet support. Ethan, older and more reserved, was furious but held his anger close, saying little. I reassured them both, apologizing for the chaos and promising that no matter what, they were my priority. Through everything, that much was clear. My kids were the reason I had worked so hard to provide a stable life. And they were the reason I would move forward. Irish luck might have set this disaster into motion, but it also gave me the strength to end it. The following Monday, I met with an attorney and filed for divorce. When I got home later that day, a police car sat in my driveway. Lauren had been released on bail, likely with Derek's help, and was there to retrieve some personal belongings under police supervision. She looked at me expectantly as if hoping for some reaction, but I simply read the restraining order aloud before turning away. That weekend was quiet. I focused on clearing out the remains of my garage, salvaging whatever tools survived the fire. My diagnostic equipment was gone, and insurance wasn't giving me a straight answer on the claim since Lauren was a co-owner of the property. Another battle for another day. As I worked, I thought back on my marriage. Lauren had been my first love and, until now, my only one. But I was clearly not hers. Trust had been everything to me, and she had shattered it beyond repair. Forgiveness wasn't an option. I held grudges, and this level of betrayal was unforgivable. Still, I needed answers. Was Derek the first? Had this started because of something I had done? Or had Derek been feeding her a narrative, making her see me as small, insignificant? Curiosity got the better of me. A quick online search revealed Derek Foster had been hired 2 years ago to oversee her company's 4 locations. Right around the time Lauren's behavior had changed. He was a divorced father of 3, living about an hour away, and the more I read, the more questions I had. I decided to reach out to the company's owner, a man I had known casually over the years. He often brought his cars to my old garage, and I had always respected him. I put it on my list for Monday. On Sunday evening, my phone rang. Lauren. Her tone was unusually soft, almost apologetic. "Mark, I'm so sorry for everything, especially the fire." I kept my voice flat. "Can I come home?" she asked. "No. I have a restraining order," I said bluntly. "I know," she admitted. "They told me when my parents bailed me out." "Good for them," I replied coldly. "I just want to talk," she pleaded, insisting the fire had been a mistake, a one-time lapse in judgment. I wasn't playing that game. When I brought up the motel, she went silent. Then, as expected, she tried to deny it. I hung up. Later that night, her father showed up at my door. He was a good man, someone I had known for over 25 years, almost like a second father to me. He looked tired, confused. "She told me you two had a fight, and you kicked her out," he said carefully. "Half true," I replied. Then I explained the fire. The affair. His face darkened. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Not sure. Things have been off for 2 years, but the last 3 months were unbearable. He nodded, his expression hollow. A few hours later, I received a text from him. I'm sorry. She must have finally told the truth. The next morning, I called Lauren's employer. I hate to bring this up, I started, but I thought you should know why I'm divorcing Lauren. I explained the affair. The owner sighed. I can't say I'm surprised. I had my doubts about hiring Derek. I asked him not to fire Lauren, at least not yet. Her income would factor into the divorce settlement, and I didn't want her playing the victim if she lost her job too soon. He agreed, saying she was a good employee despite her personal choices. Derek, however, wasn't as lucky. By Friday, his week had gone from bad to worse. His car broke down and had to be towed, delaying his arrival at work. When he finally showed up, the owner was waiting for him, with termination papers in hand. Later that day, Lauren called in a fury. What did you do? She snapped. Nothing, I said calmly. Maybe it's time we stick to communicating through our lawyers. She kept calling, but I ignored her. Instead, I focused on something more productive, using the information I had gathered about Derek to contact his ex-wife. Jenna Foster was more than willing to talk. She had her own grievances against Derek and, after a long conversation, was eager to help me with my next move. That weekend, I made a dinner reservation at a family-favorite restaurant and invited Ethan and Caitlin. I had one goal, to make Lauren and Derek see the strength of the family they had tried to destroy. Revenge wasn't just about payback. It was about reclaiming control over my life. Months passed, and my divorce case moved forward. As everything started to settle into place, I planned one final move. I invited my children to dinner, and I also invited Jenna. We arrived early, and when Jenna joined us, I introduced her to Ethan and Caitlin. Confusion flickered across their faces until I explained exactly who she was. Their expressions shifted from shock to understanding. Over dinner, Jenna shared her story, how Derek's betrayal had unraveled her marriage, how she had learned the hard way that forgiveness doesn't always lead to healing, and how trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to rebuild. Her honesty struck a chord with all of us. By the end of the evening, my children were engaged in the conversation, asking questions, sharing their own observations about the changes they had noticed in their mother over the past year. It was eye-opening and painful. They had suspected something long before I did. After dinner, Jenna and I lingered, letting the night stretch out longer than it needed to. We danced, we talked, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to ease. When she invited me back to her hotel, I hesitated. The idea of getting back at Lauren with something so simple and immediate was tempting, but I wasn't ready. The wounds were too fresh, and I wasn't about to let my first step forward be tangled up in revenge. Instead, we met for breakfast the next morning. A familiar waitress greeted us, her gaze flicking over to the empty space where Lauren used to sit. The judgment in her eyes was almost amusing. Jenna and I exchanged knowing smiles, both aware that the gossip would reach Lauren sooner rather than later. Sure enough, Lauren called a few days later, her voice thick with anger. Dinner and breakfast with Derek's ex? Really? I didn't bother getting defensive. You lost the right to question me the second you burned our marriage down. Her fury only grew, but I didn't care. I let her rant, then hung up. Days later, my attorney called with news. Lauren had finally signed the divorce papers. My guess? She had spoken to her father. Maybe he had finally convinced her to face reality. Our first real interaction after everything was at Caitlin's graduation. We managed to stay on opposite sides of the venue during the ceremony, but later, she found me. The bitterness in her tone was subdued, replaced by something almost cautious as she asked about Jenna. I deflected, not giving her anything, but I noticed how she had changed. She looked thinner, older. The weight of her own mistakes had settled onto her shoulders, making her appear smaller somehow. She admitted Derek had left the state after losing his job, struggling to find work. He hadn't taken her with him. Her voice wavered when she insisted she never loved him. I let the words sit between us before answering. You didn't love me enough either. Her eyes welled with tears. I could see her mother watching from a few feet away, sympathy already forming in her expression. But I was done. I turned and walked away. The divorce finalized smoothly. No drawn-out fights over money. We sold the house, split what was left, and neither of us owed the other alimony. Caitlin's college was covered through a second mortgage, and Ethan used his share to open his own auto repair shop. Seeing him take those steps, watching him build something for himself, made me prouder than I could put into words. Lauren, meanwhile, had to deal with the consequences of her actions. She pled guilty to arson, receiving a suspended sentence and mandatory therapy. Over time, the classes seemed to help, but there was no fixing what had been broken. Months after the divorce was finalized, she reached out. She wanted to meet. She picked a restaurant that used to mean something to us. Maybe she thought it would bring back memories, soften me somehow. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting stiffly, her hands folded in her lap. She looked better, more composed, at least. We exchanged polite greetings, ordered our meals, and made small talk. But as our plates emptied, the weight of everything we hadn't said sat between us. Then she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate as she admitted she had misjudged me. She had mistaken my dedication to our family for complacency. She had thought I was holding her back when, in reality, I was doing everything I could to hold us together. Therapy had made her see things differently. I believed she was sorry, but sorry didn't change the past. We parted with a hug, and as I turned to leave, she leaned in slightly, her voice dropping into something softer, more familiar. You know, we were always good at it. I cut her off with a chuckle. Take care, Lauren. On the drive home, I called Jenna. Since that first dinner, we had stayed in touch, finding something in each other that neither of us had expected. She was honest, blunt even, admitting she had recently had a brief fling but wasn't looking for anything serious. I respected that. I asked if she was free. Dinner at her place was easy, natural. With her kids away for the week, we had the night to ourselves. Before things went further, I made sure we were on the same page. I'm not looking for anything long-term, I admitted. And I don't want you to feel like I'm using you for closure. Jenna smirked, pouring another glass of wine. Good. Same here. What followed was electric. She was confident, passionate, and entirely in control, nothing like the strained, forced intimacy I had suffered through in the last years of my marriage. Afterward, she curled against me, her fingers tracing patterns on my skin. You actually pay attention, she murmured. You listen. That's rare. I didn't realize how much I had needed to hear that until she said it. We lay there for hours, talking, laughing, peeling back the layers of our shared scars. Jenna hinted at wanting Derek to find out about us. I admitted I wouldn't mind if Lauren knew either. Not out of spite, just a quiet, final exclamation point on the mess they had made. The next morning, she kissed me long and slow before I left. Hope this isn't the last time, she said, her voice teasing. I smiled but kept it honest. No promises, but I wouldn't be opposed. We parted on good terms, no expectations, just mutual understanding. Later that day, I sent Lauren a vague, harmless text, just enough to remind her that I wasn't completely out of reach. Her reply came in under 3 minutes. She still wanted control. She no longer had it. That night, as I sat alone, I realized how far I had come. Jenna had helped me reclaim something I thought I had lost, my sense of worth. But my journey wasn't about revenge or even new connections. It was about finding peace, rediscovering who I was after years of betrayal and chaos. Some nights were easier than others, but one quiet evening, I found myself back at Smitty's, an old familiar pub. The routine of sitting in a dimly lit booth, nursing a beer, let me feel like myself again. Then I heard it. A familiar laugh. Lauren. She walked in with a group of her coworkers, their voices carrying across the bar. The moment her eyes landed on me, she froze, but only for a second. Composing herself, she led her friends to a table on the opposite side of the room. I went back to my drink, uninterested in whatever performance she was about to put on. But there was no avoiding the setup of the place. To get to the restroom, her friends had to pass my table. A few minutes later, 2 of them did just that. One of them stopped. You're Lauren's ex, right? She asked, a playful curiosity in her eyes. I nodded, unsure where this was going. She smiled, her tone friendly, maybe even flirtatious. Her friend, equally intrigued, joined in, and soon, the conversation took on an easy rhythm. They were younger than me, one by about 10 years, the other maybe 15, but they didn't seem to care. They laughed, teased, and, knowing full well Lauren was watching, I couldn't help but flirt back. Petty? Maybe. Satisfying? Absolutely. As they turned to leave, one of them, Rachel, slipped me a business card, her number scribbled on the back. I pocketed it without a second thought, but when I glanced toward Lauren's table, I found her watching. Her expression was one I had seen countless times over the years, a storm brewing behind those green eyes, a mix of anger and something deeper, something she'd never admit. But it didn't matter. That look had no power over me anymore. I finished my beer, left a tip, and walked out without another glance in her direction. The next morning, as I was clearing out my pockets, I found Rachel's card. Without thinking too hard about it, I dialed the number. She answered with warmth, curiosity. The conversation was light, playful, and before long, we had plans to meet that evening at Smitty's. The idea of dating after 25 years terrified me, but it also excited me. When I arrived that night, I had put in a little extra effort, sharper clothes, fresh shave. If I was doing this, I was doing it right. Rachel met me with a confident smile, and the conversation flowed effortlessly. At some point, I asked why she had wanted to meet me, given that she worked with Lauren. She didn't hesitate. Honestly, she used to talk about you all the time before everything. Always said you were a good man. I was curious. That answer hit me harder than I expected. The night ended back at my place, our connection deepening in a way that felt both natural and long overdue. Afterward, as we lay together, she murmured, "I like how you do it." The compliment should have made me feel good. Instead, it brought a cold rush of memory. Lauren had said the same words not long ago, and I knew now she had been comparing me to someone else. The past still had its grip on me, but I wasn't letting it win. Sunday morning was spent lazily in bed, followed by a relaxed lunch. Before parting ways, Rachel made me promise to call her again. I readily agreed. On my way home, I found another surprise. Tucked inside my bar receipt from Smitty's was a handwritten note. The waitress, Monica, had left her number. Apparently, I had entered an entirely new reality where dating worked differently, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to keep up. On Monday, I found myself back at Smitty's, chatting with Monica. Her quick wit intrigued me, and we made plans for her day off. Later that evening, my phone rang, another unexpected call. Holly. She was the other woman who had stopped at my table with Rachel. After hearing about my weekend, she decided to ask me out herself. I agreed, wondering just how long this unexpected wave of attention would last. The week unfolded in a blur of dates. Wednesday with Monica was easygoing and fun. Saturday with Holly was just as thrilling. Each woman brought something different to the table, and while I wasn't looking for anything serious, their companionship reminded me of things I had long forgotten about myself. I could be desired. I could be valued. I could be wanted for who I was, not just what I could provide. By the time Jenna invited me over for dinner on Sunday, I realized I was truly enjoying the freedom of single life. Of course, it wasn't long before Lauren caught wind of my so-called escapades. Monday evening, my phone buzzed. Lauren's name flashed on the screen. Why are you dating younger women? Her voice was tight, controlled, barely. And my coworkers, of all people? I chuckled. Why do you care? Because they work with me. She snapped. They whisper behind my back. They call me a fool for letting you go. I let that sit between us for a moment. That's not my problem, I said evenly. We're not married anymore. I can date whomever I choose. Her anger boiled over. You're an idiot. Then she hung up. Lauren's last words before hanging up echoed in my head. You're an idiot. But for the first time in years, her insults didn't sting. In fact, they barely registered. I had control of my life again, and nothing she said could change that. Whether or not these new connections led anywhere, I was determined to enjoy the journey and leave the past where it belonged. Life had taken an unexpected turn, and I was done resisting it. Still, my thoughts often wandered back to the past. No matter how much I embraced the present, the scars Lauren left behind weren't easily erased. Wednesday night with Monica was another reminder of how much my ego thrived on the attention I was getting from these women. Each encounter felt like a small, satisfying victory, proof that I had made it through the wreckage. Then Thursday rolled around, and Lauren called again. Her tone was sharp, almost accusatory, as she confronted me about Monica. I kept my voice measured. You once criticized me for dating younger women, so maybe Monica is a better fit. The irritation in her voice softened, giving way to something unexpected, regret. I'll just tell them I was stupid, she murmured, before hanging up. That brief moment of honesty left me unsettled. Lauren and I had once shared so much, but somewhere along the way, she had rewritten our history in her mind. Maybe it started when Derek entered the picture, or maybe the seeds had been planted long before. Either way, her regret was too little, too late. Feeling the weight of it all, I headed to the store. With a case of Shiner Bock in hand, I was ready to drink away the thoughts rattling in my head when my phone rang. Rachel. Her voice was bright, inviting. She could tell something was off and offered to come over. I promise I'll lift your mood, she teased. I didn't hesitate. Soon enough, we were sharing drinks, laughter, and intimacy. Her praise afterward, so familiar yet still gratifying, gave my confidence another boost. As she left, she turned back with a playful smile. Anytime. Over the next year, my world shifted again. My circle of friends with benefits expanded. Rachel, Holly, Jenna, and Monica each brought something different into my life, and I embraced the variety. Each of them taught me something new, and their shared praise only fed my growing confidence. At first, Lauren lashed out, calling me a hoe, but her insults carried no weight anymore. I enjoyed my freedom, my independence, and the company of women who actually appreciated me. And then, just as suddenly as the anger had come, it faded, replaced by something worse. Curiosity. One evening at Smitty's, she approached me. Her expression was unreadable as she leaned in and murmured, "We could always rekindle things, for old time's sake." The offer hung between us, but it held no appeal. I shook my head. What we had was built on love. If we did this now, it'd be nothing but convenience. She nodded slowly, her eyes betraying the sadness she had tried to hide. Then, without another word, she walked back to her table. For the first time, I felt something close to closure. But my real victory came the day I had been working toward for years. The Napa franchise was finally mine. The previous owner had stayed true to his word, offering me a fair deal, though it still required a significant loan. The business was thriving, and I had no doubts about its future. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had built this future with Lauren in mind, imagining financial security for both of us in our later years. Now, it was mine alone. To mark the occasion, I did something unexpected. I invited Lauren to dinner. I arranged for a car to pick her up and reserved a table at the best restaurant in the city. When she arrived, she was stunning in a black dress that highlighted her red hair and green eyes. For a brief moment, I was reminded of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. As she approached, I stood and greeted her warmly, complimenting her appearance. She returned the gesture, her eyes searching mine for some clue as to why I had brought her here. I kept her guessing. We eased into light conversation over appetizers, dancing around the real reason for the evening. By the time our main courses arrived, she couldn't take it anymore. She set down her fork and exhaled. "I can't take it. What are we celebrating?" I smiled. "I was wondering how long it would take for you to ask." I leaned back, watching her. "After we got married, I worked as a mechanic. That job seemed to satisfy you at the time." She hesitated, then admitted, "I was content, but I felt stuck. Especially as the kids got older, more involved in sports. My schedule didn't allow me to be as present as I wanted to be." I nodded. "That's why I thought taking the Napa job was the right move. It gave me flexibility." She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I remember exploding at you when you told me." I held her gaze. "And I told you it would pay off in the long run. I took that job for us, for our kids, for their dreams, for a better future." She looked down at her plate, swallowing hard. "And I destroyed it." Her voice was barely above a whisper. I shook my head. "That's not why I asked you here tonight." Her eyes met mine, cautious but hopeful. I let the silence linger before finally saying it. "Today, I signed the papers. I now own the Napa franchise. For stores." For a moment, she just stared at me. Then, slowly, realization dawned. I explained how the business was thriving, how it would provide financial security for years to come, how it would become a legacy for our children and, someday, our grandchildren. She blinked rapidly, her breath hitching. "You really did it." The pride in my voice was unmistakable. "Yeah, I did." Her expression shifted. The regret, the pain, it all crashed down on her at once. Tears welled up in her eyes, spilling over as she whispered the words I never thought I'd hear from her. "Derek told me you were a failure. No ambition, no goals, no future." And I believed him. Lauren's voice cracked as she wiped her tears. "That's why I lost respect for you, for us. It became easy to say yes to him when he promised me something better. But I ruined everything." Her face crumpled as she whispered, "You were a great husband, an incredible father, and the best lover I ever had, and I threw it all away." She looked at me desperately. "I hope you can forgive me." Overwhelmed, she excused herself to the restroom. I watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of sympathy and detachment. I had wanted to hear those words for so long, but now that she had said them, they didn't change anything. The pain of her betrayal was still there, lingering like an old wound that had never quite healed. When Lauren returned, she looked fragile but composed. I stood, letting her know the bill was taken care of and offering to drive her home. She nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. The car ride was quiet, the only sound coming from her quiet sobs. At her apartment door, she hesitated before turning to me. "Come inside?" I shook my head, my voice gentle but firm. "We can't go back there." She nodded slowly, understanding. As the door clicked shut behind her, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The next few years passed in a blur of work and fleeting relationships. My reputation seemed to spread, and I found myself enjoying a steady rotation of companionship. I made no promises, kept things casual, and ensured every encounter was mutual and respectful. Lauren and I remained in contact, though our conversations were mostly about Ethan and Caitlin. When Ethan announced his engagement to Samantha Hayes, one of his longtime customers, we talked more frequently. He was cautious, hesitant to commit until his business was more stable, but it was obvious his connection with Samantha was something real. The engagement party was held at the Sheraton Hotel. I arrived early to help Ethan set up, and just as we were finishing, Lauren walked in. She still looked striking, time having done little to dull her beauty. She found me at the punch bowl, a wistful expression crossing her face. "We never got engaged, Mark." I glanced at her, shrugging. "No, but everyone knew we were together." She smiled faintly. "Do you remember how you proposed to me?" "Of course. Some things, no matter how much time passes, never fade." There was always a strange undercurrent when Lauren and I interacted, resentment, nostalgia, and frustration tangled together. At the party, she slipped back into old habits, making subtle digs, masking them as jokes. "We should be cordial, Mark." The way she said it, like she was the bigger person, made my jaw tighten. The room was filled with laughter and conversation, but then I heard Samantha call for someone, her mother. I turned to see a woman walk in, dressed in a floral sundress, carrying herself with a quiet confidence. Her golden blonde hair framed her face perfectly, and her deep blue eyes held a quiet strength. "Vanessa." Ethan noticed my reaction instantly, smirking as he nudged me back to reality. "Don't get any ideas." "Why?" He sighed. "She's deeply religious, wary of men after what my future father-in-law did. She's not going to give you a chance." Still, he introduced us. Vanessa's smile was polite but guarded, and I could see the skepticism in her eyes. Before we could speak much, Lauren appeared, perfectly timed, as always, sliding into the conversation as if she belonged there. I took the hint and stepped back, deciding it wasn't worth getting pulled into whatever game she was playing. Throughout the evening, I mingled, chatted, and fielded a few too many jokes about my reputation. Some were lighthearted, others had an edge, but none of it bothered me. I was enjoying the night. Lauren, however, couldn't help but stir the pot. At one point, she made a pointed remark about my promiscuity in front of a guest, Dana, hinting at my supposed inability to commit. Frustration boiled in my chest, but I refused to give her the reaction she wanted. Instead, I turned to Dana and smoothly led her away to another conversation. I had no real interest in her, but if it irritated Lauren, that was a bonus. Later in the evening, I finally had a moment alone with Vanessa. She was polite, but the wariness in her eyes remained. "You have quite a reputation, Mr. Callahan." I met her gaze evenly. "So I've heard." She didn't hesitate. "My daughter is about to marry your son, and I won't have anything disrupting that. Samantha is everything to me, and I need to know Ethan is a good man." "He is," I assured her, my voice steady. "Ethan is hardworking, loyal, and he loves Samantha. He'll never be like his father." Her expression softened slightly. "That's good to hear." There was still hesitation, but something in her demeanor shifted. "I know you don't trust me," I said after a moment, "but if you're willing, I'd like to clear up any misconceptions." She studied me for a long moment before finally nodding. "Fine. We'll talk." She suggested we meet the next day after her church service, choosing a Cracker Barrel near her home. A neutral setting, but also a test, one that required effort on my part. As the engagement party continued, our glances occasionally met across the room. For the first time in years, I felt a spark of something unexpected. Hope. I could tell I intrigued Vanessa, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to. To her, I was a puzzle, one she wasn't certain she wanted to solve. As the engagement party wound down, Lauren found me again, her expression laced with concern. She wasted no time voicing her worries about Ethan and Samantha rushing into marriage, citing their relatively short courtship of just 18 months. I met her gaze calmly. "Even long relationships don't guarantee anything, Lauren. Commitment matters more than time." She fell silent, clearly reflecting on her own choices. Though I could see the regret in her eyes, it gave me a sense of quiet satisfaction to know she still lived with the weight of her decisions. The following morning, I woke early and prepared carefully. I dressed in a suit and made the hour-long drive to Vanessa's church, arriving well before the service started. It was nothing like the Catholic churches I had known. Gone were the towering stained glass windows, the solemn altars, the flickering candles. Instead, a simple wooden cross stood at the front. The congregation dressed casually, some even carrying coffee, making me feel overdressed and out of place. As the service began, I scanned the room, wondering if Vanessa had changed her mind. Then I spotted her on stage, singing with the worship team. Her voice filled the room effortlessly, commanding attention. When our eyes finally met, she smiled warmly. After the music ended, she joined me in the pew, her presence both comforting and disarming. I admitted to feeling out of place, and she suggested I take off my jacket. Following her lead, I began to relax. The service, though unfamiliar, was engaging. Afterward, Vanessa introduced me to the pastor and several members of the congregation, referring to me as Samantha's future father-in-law. Her warmth surprised me, considering her initial skepticism. At Cracker Barrel, our conversation started lighthearted but quickly shifted once our plates were nearly empty. Her tone sharpened. I have to ask, how much of what I've heard about you is true? I leaned back. Depends. What have you heard? That you're a womanizer. That you pursue women and leave them once you get what you want. Rather than take offense, I met her gaze and answered honestly. If that's the definition, then no, I'm not a womanizer. I never pursued anyone. They pursued me. She looked skeptical, but I continued. I told her the truth about Lauren, how she had been my wife for over 2 decades, how she had started an affair with her boss, how she had treated me with nothing but contempt in the months leading up to my discovery of her betrayal, and how, when confronted, she had tried to set fire to the garage with me inside. I saw Vanessa flinch at that detail. That wasn't the kind of ending I ever expected, I admitted. After the divorce, I wasn't looking for anything. But women started approaching me, maybe because Lauren had talked about me, maybe out of curiosity. I didn't chase anyone, but I also didn't turn anyone away. Each of those women knew what they were getting into. No lies. No false promises. Vanessa studied me carefully, weighing my words. I softened my tone. I know I don't fit into your world, Vanessa. I'm not the kind of man you expected to meet. And I won't pretend to be someone I'm not. But I can tell you this, I never disrespected any woman I was with. I made sure they felt valued. And I never saw them as just a way to pass the time. Her gaze stayed locked on mine. Then, after a long pause, she asked the question I knew was coming. And where exactly do I fit into all this? I exhaled, choosing my words carefully. Vanessa, you're an extraordinary woman. It's obvious you've been through as much as I have. We just handled it differently. I turned to connection and communication. You shut yourself off entirely. She didn't deny it. I continued. I want to meet someone who values monogamy. Someone I can trust. Someone I can build a life with. And if I'm being honest, I'm still looking for the one woman who could be my forever. She leaned forward slightly, watching me closely. And Lauren? She wanted to reconcile. Couldn't you forgive and forget? I shook my head. Forgiveness, maybe. But forgetting? Impossible. Once trust is broken, you question everything. Where they are. Who they're with. If they're lying to you again. That kind of doubt makes rebuilding a real relationship impossible. Vanessa sighed, glancing down at her coffee. I understand that more than you know. My ex expected me to pretend nothing happened. I couldn't do it. Not for him. Not for myself. It broke me. I nodded. That's why I kept my distance emotionally, even with the women I was seeing. I could enjoy the moment, but I wasn't willing to risk getting hurt again. Her fingers traced the rim of her cup. And yet, here you are, sitting across from me, hoping for something different. Yeah, I admitted. And I'd like to get to know you better, if you're willing. Her brow lifted. And what about all the other women? I held her gaze. If we get to the point where this feels right for both of us, I'll commit to you exclusively. No hesitation. She took a deep breath, thinking. Then, slowly, she nodded. I like you, Mark. But if you want to be with me, I have one rule, no physical intimacy until marriage. I was surprised, but not deterred. I reassured her, telling her how Lauren and I had waited until our wedding night. That seemed to ease her concerns. A small, almost hesitant smile crossed her lips. Okay, let's see where this leads. Over the next 4 months, Vanessa and I spent more time together, alternating between her place and mine. And for the first time in years, I was taking things slow. Even as I continued dating other women, something shifted. The thrill, the ego boost, it all started to feel hollow. The compliments that once fueled me, like Dana's familiar, "I like how you do it," lost their charm. What once felt like victories now felt like echoes of a life I no longer wanted. Everything with Vanessa was different. One evening over dinner, she told me she was ready to commit. Her words filled me with something I hadn't felt in years: joy. Without hesitation, I assured her of my devotion. I confessed my love, knowing it might be early, but feeling it was the right thing to say. To my relief, she didn't shy away. Instead, she admitted she was falling for me too, asking for patience as she processed her emotions. That patience paid off, and our bond deepened in a way I had never expected. Then, out of nowhere, Lauren called. Her voice was unusually cheerful, almost lighthearted, as she invited me to dinner. She insisted on privacy, offering to cook my favorite meal, roast beef with vegetables. I hesitated. There was something calculated about the way she presented it, something deliberate. But curiosity won out, and I agreed, promising to bring wine. Before heading over, I called Vanessa and filled her in. "She's probably planning something about the wedding," Vanessa suggested. "Call me later and let me know what happens." Her advice helped calm my unease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Lauren was trying to soften me up for something more. At exactly 7 p.m., I stood in front of Lauren's door, my stomach tight with unease. I already knew this dinner wasn't just about catching up. She greeted me warmly, the house smelling of slow-cooked meat and nostalgia. We settled into small talk as we ate, but I was waiting for the real reason I was here. And then, as the plates emptied, she finally got to it. Ethan's upcoming wedding had stirred memories of our own. Her voice softened as she reminisced, talking about how we met, the way we laughed, the moments we shared before life got complicated. Even back then, she admitted, we had something rare. I nodded. Those times had been good. But I could see where she was going, and I braced myself for the inevitable. She started asking questions I had no interest in answering. What went wrong between us? Why did we fall apart? She mentioned overhearing Rachel and Holly at work, their conversations about their time with me. Lauren had assumed I would grow tired of my rounds. And then, finally, she asked outright out, could we try again? I had been prepared for this moment. Over time, I had learned the importance of forgiveness, not for her sake, but for my own. I exhaled slowly. I forgive you. The relief on her face was immediate, but before she could take it as an opening, I clarified, forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. The trust we had? It's gone, and it's never coming back. Her expression crumbled as she pleaded for another chance, her voice breaking as she apologized. But there was nothing left to salvage. Lauren, I said gently, I'm in love with someone else. She froze. When she finally managed to speak, she asked the question I knew was coming. Who? I didn't hesitate. Vanessa, Samantha's mother. Understanding washed over her. She knew me well enough to realize there was no coming back from this. The rest of the meal passed in silence. It wasn't angry, just final. Before leaving, I thanked her for dinner, for the memories, for what we once had. I wished her well and encouraged her to love fully when she found someone new. As I stepped out of her apartment, I felt something I hadn't expected, closure. Driving away, I called Vanessa. She wasn't surprised, having suspected Lauren's intentions all along. She'll be okay, Vanessa reassured me. She has to figure out her own healing, just like you did. I told Vanessa how much I appreciated her, how knowing her had changed me for the better. For the first time, she said the words I had been waiting to hear. I love you, Mark. Ethan and Samantha's wedding arrived before we knew it, and Vanessa and I were inseparable throughout the celebration. We laughed, danced, held hands, so much so that people teased us about looking like a wedding couple ourselves. Lauren was there, but she left early. I had a feeling it was too much for her, seeing me with someone else, knowing that my happiness was no longer tied to her. 3 months later, Vanessa and I were a wedding couple. It was a small, intimate ceremony at our church, filled with family and close friends. Lauren didn't attend, citing a scheduling conflict, though I knew better. She had chosen to stay away rather than face the reality of my new life. Years later, I heard she had found someone new. I genuinely hoped it worked out for her. As for Vanessa and me, our bond only deepened. On our wedding night, as we lay together, she whispered the familiar phrase, I like how you do it. But this time, it wasn't about performance. This time, the emphasis was on like. A quiet testament to the love and trust we had built together. Life had come full circle. Standing on the porch of the home Vanessa and I built together, I watched the sun dip below the horizon, the warmth of the day fading into a peaceful glow. The chaos, the heartbreak, the uncertainty of the past, it was all behind me now. Vanessa joined me, her golden hair catching the last rays of light as she handed me a glass of iced tea. "You're quiet," she said softly. I smiled, squeezing her hand. "Just thinking how lucky I am." She leaned against me, and in that moment, words weren't necessary. Everything I had been through, every misstep, every heartbreak, it had all led me here. To her. To this life. To a love built on trust, understanding, and the quiet kind of happiness that no longer felt like a question, just a promise.